On Saturday, August 20th, 1927, Underworld captured the screen of New York's Paramount Theater, and it didn't let go. Word traveled fast. People lined up for the next show, and the next, and the next. Years later, Josef von Sternberg wrote proudly that Underworld was the first movie that forced a theater to stay open all night. Von Sternberg's success was hard-won and a long time coming. Not until Underworld did his talents coalesce with the right subject and studio, a combination that launched his career as a major Hollywood director. Underworld is often credited with jump-starting the fashion for the modern gangster film. It is also a brilliant study in tempo, visual style, and decentered narrative, the first of a great series of 6 features von Sternberg created at Paramount in the late 20s, including The Last Command and The Docks of New York. This is the story of how Underworld came to be. Joe Sternberg, a boy from an impoverished family of immigrants from Vienna, now living in New York City, chanced upon a job helping repair damaged film prints. Mechanically and visually inclined, he absorbed as much as he could. He found jobs in the bustling Fort Lee, New Jersey film community, moving from one department to another. He wanted to learn everything, and in time worked directly for the head of World Films, William Brady. When he was made supervisor of the laboratory, he watched over every film that came through. He observed directors shooting films. The French made a lasting impression. Émile Chautard, Maurice Tourneur. Around the end of 1917, Sternberg was asked to supervise lab work as part of the American war effort, on top of his lab work at World Films. In 1918, he joined the photographic division of the Signal Corps on a special assignment to Columbia University, where he gave instruction in creating training films. In 1919, Chautard made Sternberg his assistant for The Mystery of the Yellow Room, asking him to direct some scenes on his own. Later, Chautard appeared as an actor in von Sternberg's Morocco, Shanghai Express, and Blonde Venus. Von Sternberg went to Europe and found work in England, where future Underworld actress Evelyn Brent met him, working as a set designer. After more traveling in Europe, von Sternberg arrived in Los Angeles. Von Sternberg recounted that the von was attached to his name at that time, while he was assisting director William Neal on the films By Divine Right and Vanity's Price. By luck and circumstance, British actor George K. Arthur and von Sternberg met at a time when both had big ambitions and little luck breaking through to public recognition. They decided to pool their resources, primarily their resourcefulness and von Sternberg's experience, and make a film of their own, The Salvation Hunters. How strange that when von Sternberg decided he wanted to become a mainstream Hollywood director, he would write and direct a film about thought, which The Salvation Hunters tells us is its story. What would be less likely to bring Sternberg a Hollywood career than a film that announced itself to be about abstraction, not action? He even filled the screen with a title, The Thought. Situated among drifters in urban waterfront settings, it has a spare plot, little action, and a slow pace, as if we are watching a photographer thinking in cinematic images meant to be contemplated. Sternberg described it like this: I had in mind a visual poem. Instead of flat lighting, shadows. In the place of pasty masks, faces in relief, plastic and deep-eyed. Instead of scenery, which meant nothing, an emotionalized background that would transfer itself into my foreground. Instead of saccharine characters, sober figures moving in rhythm. Instead of stars, I had engaged extras, and instead of extras, I had planned to use a well-known star for 1 or 2 scenes. And dominating all this was an imposing piece of machinery. The hero of the film was to be a dredge. The Salvation Hunters was produced independently by Arthur for less than $5,000, with almost no money paid up front and a lot of promises. It was shot on location in San Pedro, the port of Los Angeles, and in a cheap rented studio. Only one actor was paid in advance. Von Sternberg wrote, directed, edited, and pulled together the sets. A young man, George K. Arthur, and woman, Georgia Hale, live in abject poverty next to a dredge that is in constant movement, scooping mud from a channel. They rescue a little boy from a cruel dock worker and protect him. The woman is indifferent to the young man, to everyone and everything. She disrespects him as a coward. But to him, she represents the idea of love. Unable to find work in the docks, he convinces her to go to the city with the child in search of something better. But he can't find work there either. And it looks as if the girl will have to resort to prostitution to get food. In the end, this collection of orphans comes together and fends for itself. The boy takes the lead, fighting off a pimp. They walk down the country road, toward the sun. Now they believe in themselves. Now they have hope. Although The Salvation Hunters is sometimes called the first avant-garde feature film, von Sternberg did not want to be relegated to the art cinema circuit. He wanted to become a Hollywood director, but on his own terms. To get where he wanted to go, however, he would have to rethink how to put across his terms in a story form that would appeal to audiences. At the same time, he would continue to develop the unique cinematic visualization that he would become justly famous for. Chaplin and his friends Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford released The Salvation Hunters through their company United Artists and promoted it with Chaplin's personal endorsement in the national press. Von Sternberg had made an artistic masterpiece independently for only $5,000. He was a cinematic genius. Moving Picture World ran a lavish rags-to-riches story. Josef von Sternberg, who is he? The inside story of a true success romance. Here for the first time is told the real inside story of the making of a motion picture that, overnight, brought a 30-year-old unknown from obscurity to the limelight as Mary Pickford's next director. Mary Pickford told the press in October 1924, 3 months before The Salvation Hunters was released, that von Sternberg would write and direct 2 films for her. He went to Pittsburgh to study a coal mining community to get atmosphere for his story. Pickford would play a blind girl in Backwash. Not completely blind. Her vision is clouded over, allowing for unusual visualizations through her eyes. Her father, a miner, cannot express emotions with his face. Inside, he cries. A large deaf-mute man is in love with her. The girl always smiles, but she's only pretending. In the end, she blames her God for her blindness, and her vision returns. Given this story, Pickford withdrew, commenting that it was a bit too morbid in spots and lacked sufficient comedy relief to warrant her chancing it in the present shape. That was the end of von Sternberg working with Pickford. In January 1925, The Salvation Hunters opened in San Francisco. Von Sternberg was getting wonderful press coverage for its originality. He landed another Hollywood writer-director job, this time for MGM. Studio reports on his story for The Exquisite Sinner, his first project, were appreciative but apprehensive about the very qualities that von Sternberg's films would become known for. This writer thinks in pictures, and what's more, in pictures likely to carry across to the screen the writer's thought. Though undoubtedly this thought is interesting, it seems to be directed toward treatment, rather than the logical and consistent development of the story. Somehow we are presented only with the surface of things and actions, without being revealed the hidden springs that motivate the actions. Thus, while the present script offers a suitable vehicle for directorial originality, the story, so far as presented in the sketchy outline, lacks convincing power. A preview screening of von Sternberg's film in March 1925 confirmed the studio's worry that the story was too difficult for the audience to follow because the main character's motivations were unclear. Dark and elusive in von Sternberg's hands, and reputedly brilliant by the few who saw it, The Exquisite Sinner was reworked by another director and released a year later, now advertised as a farce comedy, although it still carried von Sternberg's name as director. Today, no version is known to exist. The Masked Bride, starring Mae Murray, the star of von Stroheim's The Merry Widow, was von Sternberg's second project for MGM. This time, in the face of interference from the beginning, he resigned. Film Daily's headline ran, "Von Sternberg out. Director claims he's quit MGM." Louis B. Mayer reported disappointed in new film. Robert Florey, who assisted von Sternberg on both films, later wrote, "Sternberg never shot 1 foot of film indifferently." 2 magnificent reels were shot before the director pointed the camera toward the ceiling and departed. Von Sternberg went to Europe again. At the end of 1925, there was talk that he would make a film in Germany. But in January, Chaplin asked him to write and direct a dramatic film for him. That meant that von Sternberg's Hollywood career would continue with a prestige production. But the press reminded readers that MGM's The Exquisite Sinner had to be reshot by another director. Chaplin wanted to relaunch the career of Edna Purviance, his leading lady in so many of his early comedies. This would be a follow-up to her starring role in A Woman of Paris, the first drama Chaplin had directed and the first film in which he did not appear. He would not appear in this film either. First called Seagulls, later A Woman of the Sea, von Sternberg wrote, directed, and at least partly edited it. Press notices followed the film's progress. But when A Woman of the Sea was finished, Chaplin decided not to release it. He gave no explanation to anyone. Von Sternberg set up a preview screening on his own, something Chaplin would have hated, on June 25, 1926, at the Beverly Theater in Beverly Hills. Probably he hoped an enthusiastic response would change Chaplin's mind. Wilfred Beaton wrote a rave review in the Film Spectator. "There is not a shot in the entire 7 reels that is not beautiful, but von Sternberg always applies his art to the telling of his story. It is the best audience picture that von Sternberg has yet made, and shows that he is making definite progress toward gaining popularity." Von Sternberg included John Grierson's comment about Woman of the Sea in his memoirs. The irony of this film is that it is the most beautiful picture ever produced in Hollywood, and the least human. In 1933, Chaplin had the negative destroyed to avoid paying taxes on it. But a document emerged recently showing that there were 2 prints and 2 negatives. And so the search for one of the most famous and strangely lost films of all time should continue. Von Sternberg's pursuit of abstraction, thought, and transferred eroticism can be extrapolated from the surviving records. The final title list includes the Pacific Ocean and the cast of characters. The titles equate the inevitability of the ebb and flow of the sea, a key element in von Sternberg's developing cinematic lexicon, with man's powerlessness in the face of sexual desire. Ominous titles at the beginning are repeated at the end of the film. Unlike the Salvation Hunters, A Woman of the Sea does not end with hope. The environment has become elemental. The pull of the sea is equated with the weakness of human nature. Von Sternberg's career now looked bleak. His rapid rise and fall had been heavily covered by the press. Variety summed it up in September 1926. Josef von Sternberg, 2 years ago hailed as the greatest director yet, and who kept on being hailed until his Salvation Hunters flopped, has now had his Seagull rejected by Charlie Chaplin. Von Sternberg left for Europe. When he returned, he found work at Paramount. Undaunted and unapologetic, von Sternberg accepted a demotion for another chance to prove himself. His reputation as an editor and a fast worker who could do a lot with little money was intact. He claimed that in 1 week, he could re-edit, write, and reshoot scenes for an Esther Rolson, Clara Bow, Gary Cooper film, Children of Divorce, that would make it releasable. He was hired. According to his assistant, Arthur Jacobson, this was a tough job because they were all working on their own pictures. Producer Sam Jaffe said, "You've got to get with the assistant directors on the other 3 pictures and lay out a schedule so that you can get your work done without interfering with them and not tire out the actors." It meant that Joe von Sternberg, James Wong Howe, and I worked 24 hours a day for 7 days. We never went home. We never quit shooting. Whenever we could get the actors between scenes, we'd rush them over, change their clothes, and do their scenes. Von Sternberg's version was released, and it worked. The studio took notice. Von Sternberg was even listed as co-director of Children of Divorce in Paramount's May 1927 sales campaign book, although his name did not appear in the film's credits. He impressed Paramount so much that he was assigned to Underworld, not as director, but as technical assistant. Now von Sternberg had a chance that he could not afford to miss. Underworld was going to be directed by Arthur Rawson. In early January 1927, there was a shakeup after Rawson had been working for some months with Ben Hecht on the story. Von Sternberg was promoted to a newly created position, according to West Coast production head B.P. Schulberg. Rather than one director, Underworld, already billed as Ben Hecht's remarkable story of gangster life, would have 2, one for dramatic action, and, in Schulberg's words, one who might be termed a director of photographic innovation. Josef von Sternberg, whose sensational production, The Salvation Hunters, which introduced a new method of telling film stories, making him at the time the most talked of individual in the picture world, has signed for this latter extremely important post. The drama director had not yet been named, meaning that Art Rawson was out. Schulberg continued, "Von Sternberg has a unique genius for which there is a distinct place in motion pictures. As director of photography, he stands alone. He is the supreme master of symbolism, and his sense of composition is so extraordinary as to be overwhelming in its results. He paints with a camera, as Ben Hecht writes, with a vivid, compelling power. In Underworld, he will have opportunities for picturing the lights and shades of life, such as rarely have been accorded a director. In engaging von Sternberg for this special work, Paramount is following its policy of seeking out genius and placing it in the niche where it will be most effective." Von Sternberg was a genius again. Schulberg underlined the strength that he had shown consistently throughout his rocky career. But genius was a precarious position. No one knew that better than Josef von Sternberg. He would have to make good on action as well as abstraction if he wanted to break into Hollywood as a commercially reliable director. In February, von Sternberg was named the writer assigned to Emil Janning's new film, to be called Street of Sin, directed by Moritz Stiller. He also became a production supervisor at Paramount, first of all over his own films. By March, he was named the one and only director of Underworld. He began to revise the script, working closely with Paramount's German art director, Hans Dreyer, who had worked with Lubitsch in Germany and in Hollywood, and who had head Paramount's art department for decades. These drawings, and those for almost all of von Sternberg films at Paramount, were made by Dreyer himself. Von Sternberg was also working with cinematographer Bert Glennon, who had been given permission, it was reported, by the director, who was known for his camera artistry, to carry out novel effects for lights and shadows in the production. Glennon would work with von Sternberg again on The Last Command, Blonde Venus, and The Scarlet Empress. Paramount was so impressed with Underworld that it screened a rough cut at its annual convention in May, where the upcoming releases for the 1927-28 season were showcased. Ben Hecht was the most famous person associated with the production. Neither the director nor any of the lead actors had star status, although Underworld would change that for all of them. The Chicago newspaper reporter and essayist was a first-hand authority on Prohibition-era organized crime. He had perfect credentials for creating a gangster film hit. This was Hecht's first step in a film career that he would fill with great scripts. Hecht based his story loosely on Chicago gangster Tommy O'Connor, who had made headlines coast to coast. He broke out of jail before he could be hanged and was never caught. Another Chicago gangster, Dean O'Banion, used a florist's shop as a front, like Buck Mulligan in the film. Hecht said that he worked out the second version of the story he wrote for Paramount with Art Rawson, for whom he had high praise. He blamed von Sternberg for adding sentimental touches that falsified his story. According to von Sternberg, Hecht was so incensed that he wanted his name taken off the credits. Von Sternberg's story is very much changed from the final script in the Paramount file, as well as both versions of the story Hecht wrote. He makes it visual, and he streamlines it. He gets rid of most of the secondary characters and locations. He simplifies every action, and he builds up a dynamic rhythm to the story, scene by scene. He has mastered camera placement and editing for maximum impact, whether he is showing a character's thoughts or actions. Like musical orchestration, von Sternberg expands and contracts the story, controlling its tempo throughout the film. One of the most famous scenes in Underworld is the jewelry robbery, conveyed in 5 quick, indirect shots. In order to say so much with so little, von Sternberg set up the elements in advance. The flower in Mulligan's lapel in the Dreamland Cafe scene connects us to the flower shop he uses for his office. Bull watches Feathers as he tells her she doesn't really want the jewelry in the store window. But his expression tells us that he has another idea in mind. Just before Bull leaves, Rolls-Royce and Feathers, alone together, Rolls puts a flower in Bull's lapel, with a hint that it could be useful in the robbery he knows is about to take place. Therefore, there is no doubt that the flower was dropped to link the robbery to Mulligan. Unlike the script version, von Sternberg places this brief episode in between two scenes played with a leisurely tempo, in which Rolls-Royce and Feathers circle around each other slowly, wondering if there is sexual desire, and almost ending in a kiss. Loyalty to their mutual protector stops them, but Bull returns to a changed couple. Rolls-Royce and Feathers have found a new desire and respect for each other. Unlike the script, in which Mulligan's murder is followed by police rushing in to haul Bull off to jail, von Sternberg cuts directly from Bull laughing triumphantly at his success in getting what he wants, Mulligan dead, to the judge in the courtroom about to pronounce the death penalty verdict. Streamlining the actions is not done at the expense of Underworld's subtle character development. For Ben Hecht, Feathers is only an accessory to Bull, street-smart and loyal, although Bull doubts her for a while. For von Sternberg, Feathers is a direct descendant of the woman in The Salvation Hunters, and prefigures the woman to come in many of his films. She is smart, attractive, often diffident, and hard to read. When she shows that she cares, it is a big step. Her desirability is crucial to the von Sternberg love triangle, in which two men love the same woman. Here, as sometimes later, the more powerful one ends up by giving her, or letting her go, to his rival. Brent, for the record, was already known as the Queen of the Underworld in 1924, because she had done so many gangster films at the low-budget FBO studio. Von Sternberg worked his actors long and hard to achieve exactly what he wanted. Evelyn Brent appreciated that, remembering how long it took to get that feather to float downward in the breeze. When I saw it, I realized why he wanted it. It stamped my whole character. He knew as much about cameras as any cameraman did. That's where a lot of the time was spent. In those days, we didn't have any stand-ins. We had to do the standing in ourselves. He would have it all mapped out. You'd stand under those hot lights while they'd move 'em all around. All this before you get to the scene, and you're exhausted. I never minded it, because Joe was a stickler for making you see rushes every day. It helped you to get an understanding what he was taking the time to try to do. He got very angry if anyone missed seeing the rushes. Joe started a picture with a conception of what he wanted on the screen, and that's why I believed in him and trusted him. Von Sternberg gave his characters emotional depth and gravity. Hecht calls Bull Weed the killer. He is simple and primal. In von Sternberg's Underworld, Bull Weed's perceptive intelligence is established from the beginning, through his eyes and his expression, as he sizes up the drunk he took off the street after the opening robbery. He makes the decision to bankroll him, to call him Rolls-Royce, and to trust him. Bull's sensitivity and warmth is shown in another way when he is hiding in the dark apartment after breaking jail and he hears a noise at the door. After a masterful example of suspense, shadow language, and choreographed movement, Bull pulls the door open to find a kitten and a bottle of milk. He brings in the kitten gently. And lets it lick milk from his finger. The charge of sentimentality, or lack of realism, was primarily targeted at the way Underworld ends, by reviewers and probably by Hecht, whose much more violent follow-up to Underworld several years later, Scarface, ends the gangster's life in relentless gunfire. The script and subsequent story synopses changed the ending many times. Bullweed dies, most often by falling on a grenade to save Feathers, whose loyalty he finally believes because Rolls-Royce has managed to throw a message through the window explaining that the lies spread about her are false. Feathers and Rolls-Royce end up going off together after his death. The ending that von Sternberg got away with keeping as he wanted, despite a more traditional happy ending epilogue that was shot, is an important signature piece, showing how the director had come around to a new way for him to construct a story that would allow free rein to his imagination and visual composition, while creating a consistent portrait strong enough to carry the audience, if not all the critics, with it, in spite of, or even because of, its improbability. What is important is that Bullweed chooses his own death, like he has chosen everything else he has done in von Sternberg's version of the story. When he sees Feather's love for the injured Rolls-Royce, who has managed, improbably, to make it through the gunfire to give Bull the key to his escape door at the risk of his own life, we see the expression on Bull's face, once again, as he is thinking. He makes the decision to let the lovers go and to wave the white flag of surrender to the police. It is as if their loyalty to him, overriding their love for each other, restores his faith in himself. One last time, we see Bull's powerful, infectious smile as he explains to the patrolman what this extra hour means to him. At the end, the most important thing to Bullweed is an idea and an emotion. Although the advance press made it seem that Paramount felt it had a big hit coming in Underworld, and von Sternberg was promoted and given prestige advance projects, either the management was divided on the issue or worried for other reasons. For one thing, the advertising promoted supervising producer Hector Turnbull's name in huge letters. Sometimes von Sternberg's name was absent. Sometimes it was barely legible because the print was so small. Underworld had been advertised as a special for months and months, but it was not released that way. The announcement of the change came at about the same time as news that Chicago might ban the film. And so for its New York premiere, Underworld was only booked for a one-week run at the Paramount Picture Palace in Times Square, without the special treatment of then moving to a smaller luxury theater in the same area. The immediate, overwhelming audience response to the film was completely unexpected. Underworld opened on a Saturday morning. The Paramount Theater started running ads announcing extra screenings. Midnight screenings were advertised for Wednesday and Thursday. Then an unusual conciliatory ad was published. So as not to disappoint the New York public, Underworld would continue at the luxurious nearby Rivoli for an unlimited run. Underworld was a huge audience draw and moneymaker everywhere it played. All three of the principal actors were praised, and Bancroft became a star, officially. He renegotiated his contract with Paramount. Once again, von Sternberg was called a genius. The Salvation Hunters was brought back to play at New York's Cameo Art Cinema. Von Sternberg was in the news continuously. He was named to re-edit von Stroheim's Wedding March, sympathetically, now that Paramount had taken it out of his hands. No sooner was von Sternberg slated to make a new Bancroft film than he replaced Victor Fleming as director of the film that became The Last Command, with A-list German star Emil Jannings, whom he would direct again a few years later, and Germany's first important sound film, The Blue Angel. Von Sternberg would direct 3 films with Bancroft after The Last Command: The Dragnet, now a lost film, The Docks of New York, and von Sternberg's first sound film, Thunderbolt. The Dark Horse at the beginning of 1927. Josef von Sternberg won Paramount's $10,000 prize for making the Best Picture of the year. At the very first Academy Awards ceremony, Ben Hecht won the award for Best Original Story, Underworld. Von Sternberg had succeeded in combining abstraction, visual experimentation, and action on his own terms, negotiating a viable path within mainstream Hollywood cinema. Perhaps the only one not surprised was the director himself.